And welcome to the latest Sporties and Pilot Workshops webinar. We are very glad you could join us today for IFR Procedures. Very excited about this one. We're going to dive into the nitty-gritty of instrument flying and those procedures, whether it's departures, arrivals, approaches. Try to give you some very practical tips to make your next instrument flight safer and more comfortable. My name is John Zimmerman. I'll be your facilitator today. Ryan Koch will be the presenter. I'll introduce him in just a minute. This is, again, a collaborative presentation from Sporties and Pilot Workshops. And just a few housekeeping things as we get started. First, this webinar will be recorded, so if you have to step away for a moment, don't worry. We'll have a video of this up within the next 24 hours. You can find that at the Pilot Workshops YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/pilotworkshops. Please check that out, and please subscribe while you're there. Lots of great content from the flight instructors at Pilot Workshops. Secondly, there's some interactive features with the GoToWebinar platform that we're on, so we invite you to take advantage of those. You can ask questions over in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask those. We'll answer as many of those as we can, and if we can't get to them all, we'll try to answer those after the webinar. Second, we'll have 3 polls we put out today as Ryan goes through the presentation. You'll see these launch on screen. All you have to do is pick your answer, and we'll take it from there. And then third, there is a free handout you'll see over in, again, the control panel, and that's a free sample of the IFR Procedures Manual that much of this content is based on, and is a great tool for you to brush up on some of your instrument procedures. So be sure to download that before the end of the webinar. I mentioned that IFR Procedures Manual, that is what this inspired this webinar, and Ryan wrote this book, a great resource for understanding IFR procedures, 144 pages with some really beautiful pictures and illustrations. I'm a huge fan of this book. Even if you've been flying IFR a long time, there are many, many things in here that you will have either forgotten or never learned. So definitely check out pilotworkshops.com if you want to learn more about this manual. Right now, free shipping is being offered, so it's a great time to buy it. And again, whether you're starting out in instrument training or a longtime pro, I think it's one of the best books out there in aviation. One more shameless plug, and then I'll turn it over to Ryan. We have just launched at Sporties a brand new website called IFR Focus, and anybody attending this webinar, I think, would enjoy this website. It's a free site loaded with articles, videos, interactive scenarios, quizzes, and it's all about flying IFR. There's a monthly column from Jeff Van West, former editor of IFR Magazine and now working at Pilot Workshops. He goes into the real nitty-gritty of IFR procedures, and that's excellent. You'll also see some things from Ryan here and me and others at Sporties. So ifrfocus.com is the address. There's a free email newsletter you can sign up for. It's brand new, only been out about 2 weeks, and so you're getting a first look at it. I would encourage anybody who's doing any type of instrument flying, check this out. With that out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Koch. Ryan is a instrument flight instructor, director of new product development at Pilot Workshops. So he's the man behind a lot of the products you see from Pilot Workshops. And he's going to dive into some of the really great tools you can take advantage of as an instrument pilot, but maybe some of the things that you haven't looked at recently, and maybe some of the things you never learned in the first place. So let me throw some control over here to Ryan, and we'll get him started.
All right, well, thanks, John. Hey, everybody, thanks for coming. So this will be IFR procedures. We're going to cover 3 different topics, and these are the 3 topics. They're all procedures, or the components of procedures, but they're also chapters in the book that John just plugged there, the IFR Procedures book from Pilot Workshops. We're going to start with fly a visual climb over the airport, and we're going to cover a little bit of IFR departure basics in order to set up the context for why VCOA makes sense and how it's useful. Then we're going to go into get vectors to final, which is something that happens on practically every approach, but there are still some traps and gotchas and best practices and things that can help you do things smoothly. And then follow advisory plus V guidance. And this is not going to be a primer on these topics. I'm assuming that you've at least encountered these things before, but it is going to be a collection of interesting insights and hopefully useful tips for you. So let's dive into fly a visual climb over the airport, or a VCOA. And to set this up, like I said, I want to start by giving a little bit of context to departure procedure basics. First of all, when an airport has no approach procedures, it's also not been surveyed for departures. So an example of that is this Johnson City Airport here, the way that you know it has no procedures at a glance on the IFR low and route chart is that it's brown. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of luck. You can certainly, as a Part 91 pilot, depart an airport like this under IFR. You can even do it into IMC, but it's going to require some careful planning and studying of the sectional, knowing the terrain, getting a mental picture of the terrain that's around, but you're not necessarily out of luck. Every other airport where there are approaches has also been subject to a departure survey. And so these airports are going to have some guaranteed, FAA guaranteed way of departing safely, or they're going to explicitly flag things as not authorized. But broadly speaking, what are the outcomes of this departure survey? Well, first of all, it could determine that it's safe to climb in any direction following some basic departure rules. This is called a diverse departure, but you can think of it as kind of a default departure. You can climb safely in any direction as long as you make no turns prior to 400 AGL, climb at least 200 feet per nautical mile. And the example that I have here is Stevens Point, Wisconsin. This happens to be my home airport. And looking at the takeoff minimums document, there's no departure procedure. There are no takeoff minimums listed. There's just a list of low close-in obstacles. And the absence of a procedure or a climb gradient or a takeoff minimum just implies that the diverse departure criteria is in play and you can take off and turn in any direction. And you can think of these as the default rules, and these exist unless they're overridden by something else. And some ways that that might happen is, okay, what if we can't depart safely in any direction? There's some direction that has an obstruction. There are a couple ways that this might be handled. First of all, it might be handled by a greater climb gradient that's specified. This is Viroqua, Wisconsin. And you can see that off of runway 11, they've specified a climb of 460 feet per nautical mile to 1,500 feet, which is just a few hundred feet AGL. So it's not that significant, but that's how they've handled an obstacle in the departure area by raising the climb gradient. It's also worth noting here that runways 2 and 20 are not authorized for environmental reasons. This is a grass runway, and that's pretty typical. But also runway 29 is just missing. It's just not mentioned here. And that doesn't mean that it's not authorized for an IFR departure. It means that that diverse criteria, that sort of default criteria apply. So for runway 29, you could take off and turn in any direction safely. Another solution would be an obstacle departure procedure, which provides a known safe heading or course, and often also a climb gradient to get you to a point from which you can then climb on course in any direction. So this is Wausau, Wisconsin, and runway, well, all the runways here require a climb on runway heading to a certain altitude before then turning on course. It also specifies climb gradients for runway 5 and runway 23. 13 and 31 aren't mentioned, and again, that's because the default diverse criteria apply, the 200 feet per mile climb gradient. A common misconception here is that if the departure procedure off of runway 23, for example, is a climb of 362 feet per nautical mile to 2,100 feet, that 2,100 feet is then a safe en route altitude. It's not. It's just that from that point on, you don't have to climb at 362 feet per mile anymore. The 200 feet per mile will do. But this sets up what a VCOA is. So a third way to solve this is, what if, rather than making this 200 foot per nautical mile climb from the ground, you could start this climb from some point higher up above the airport such that it would clear any obstacles by the required margin. And that's really all that a VCOA is. That's how you should think about it, is if you could start from higher by getting to that point visually, then you can climb in any direction. And this isn't a roll your own sort of procedure. This isn't something you make up as you go along. This is actually a published IFR procedure. So let's take a look at a few. But first of all, of course, if it's going to be a visual climb over the airport, you have to be able to do it visually. So that's also going to set a minimum ceiling and visibility. Of course, you have to be able to do this below this overcast layer. All right, so let's look at Lovelock, Nevada, Derby Field, which is KLOL, which is a great identifier. And let's say we were departing runway 2. There are a couple ways that we could do it. So beginning with the takeoff minimums here, we're offered a climb of 415 feet per nautical mile to 8,200 feet. but that's kind of steep for a lot of GA airplanes. Certainly if you're flying something like a Skyhawk, you're going to struggle with that. But you're not out of luck because we're also offered, if the weather is 3,203, a climb in visual conditions is an option. And that actual procedure then is described at the bottom here. You have to obtain ATC approval for the VCOA when you're requesting your IFR clearance. ATC needs to know what you're doing. And then you just climb in visual conditions to cross the airport at or above 7,000 before proceeding on course. You might wonder how you could climb to 7,000 if the weather was 3,200 overcast. Well, it's because 7,000 is MSL that you see on your altimeter, and 3,200 is the AGL ceiling. So 3,200 is about 7,000 MSL here. 3,200 AGL is 7,000 MSL, and that's why those two altitudes they actually line up, and it makes sense that you would need that much ceiling to be able to do this visually. And again, this procedure seems to stop at 7,000, but if you just look at the sectional, clearly 7,000 is not going to be a safe en route altitude. And it's really important, this is going to be a common theme when we talk about textual procedures, that you put these in context. You actually look at the chart, draw them out on the chart where appropriate, but sanity check these against what you know about the terrain, because it's very easy to just blindly follow text and transpose a couple numbers or something like that and get it wrong. You're a lot less likely to do that if you actually put it in context of the terrain that it's meant to avoid. So 7,000 is not a safe altitude to proceed on course unless you're also climbing. It's just that that's where the VCOA ends, and from there you can climb out in any direction, 200 feet per nautical mile, until you reach a safe en route altitude. And here's another look at the IFR low en route chart. You can see, yeah, the lowest we need to get here really is at least 10,300 if we were going to go any distance southwestbound on the airway. So VCOAs come in a few different forms. The one we just looked at, you can consider kind of a diverse VCOA. It's the equivalent of a diverse departure started from a higher altitude. This one you can kind of think of as a VCOA that sets you up to then fly the ODP from a higher altitude. And so it becomes critical to read the instructions here and not just assume VCOA means VCOA and nothing else. So here at Delta, Colorado, Blake Field, the runway 3 takeoff minimum stays standard with a climb of 412 feet per nautical mile to 10,200. And if we're unable to do that, or if we prefer not to, we have the option of 3,303 for a VCOA. But where this one differs from the last one is in the actual instructions here. So again, obtain ATC approval when requesting the IFR clearance. DME is required. GPS, of course, can be a substitute for that. But we're supposed to climb in visual conditions to cross Blake Field Airport at or above 8,300. That's where most VCOAs would end, but now this one has you fly heading at 248 and the MTJ VOR 279 radio to Brick intersection, which is the 23.44 DME, then climb and hold northwest right turns 117 inbound to cross Brick at or above 11,300. And then you're at a point from which you can climb safely in any direction if you want to. So there's a lot more involved in this one. It's a VCOA plus an ODP. This happens to be the same procedure as the ODP that's described above. And you can see how it's absolutely critical that you make sense of this beyond just reading the text. If you tried to follow just follow the text blindly here, it's a lot of numbers and courses and it would be easy to get it wrong. But when you look at the sectional, look at the low en route chart, okay, it makes sense why you'd want to do this, right? It's a quick way to get you up to a safe altitude to continue climbing toward the airway in this case and get you on your way. All right, this is our first poll question if you want to throw that up there, John. This is more of a quiz question than a poll question, I suppose, but when executing a VCOA, how close to the airport must you remain for guaranteed obstacle clearance? Is it 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles? Is it undefined, or why are you asking me? This is the first I've even heard of a VCOA, which is fair if that's the case. All right, it's looking like a close race between 3 miles, and this is the first time I've ever heard of a VCOA, but 3 miles is winning. All right, so this is a bit of a trick question, I'll be honest. It's a little bit of a gotcha question. The answer technically is that it's undefined because VCOAs don't guarantee obstacle clearance based on proximity to the airport, or at least they don't do it in the same sense that IFR procedures traditionally do. This is from the TERP's procedure design document, and it gives you a sense of how these are designed. 3 miles is roughly the amount of space that gets surveyed, but that even depends on the location and the altitude that you have to climb to. They take a typically 250 knot indicated airspeed, add a bunch of tailwind, give it a 23-degree bank angle, and that radius becomes the radius they need to protect. And you can see from the chart there what that becomes. But if you look at the diagram down below that, you'll see that it actually depicts this tower inside the surveyed area. And that's because a VCOA, the way it's designed, it kind of does the opposite of what a traditional IFR procedure does. It doesn't exclude obstacles. It doesn't guarantee a clear area. It actually contains them within a space that allows you to see and avoid them, and then specifies the weather that would allow you to do that. That would allow you to be visual inside that space that's been surveyed. Now, any of the other answers that you picked here, if you picked 1 mile, 2 mile, or 3 miles, in practice, you would be fine. That would work. And there are some VCOAs that do specify a distance that you have to remain within. Often it's 3 miles. It'll be right there in the text. But the bottom line is don't try to do these by reference to instruments alone. You might be tempted as a Part 91 pilot to say, well, the ceiling's not quite high enough for this, but I can stay close to the airport and spiral up. And if I'm in IMC a little bit, I'll just, reference my GPS to stay close enough to the airport and I'll be fine. Not necessarily. This is a visual maneuver and you are only protected by your eyes out the window here. Okay, that's the end of that section. John, do you have any questions that came up that you want me to address, or should we roll right into the next one?
Let's do one because I hit this question all the time, and one of our attendees asked this, which is, hey, that's great. You're talking about everything in terms of climb rate per nautical mile, and that is nowhere on my panel, right? Everything on my panel is about feet per minute. So how do I calculate that? Are there any rules of thumb? How do I think in terms of feet per nautical mile instead of per minute?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And we did kind of skip right past that. There is a chart that you would find in the beginning of the physical terminal procedures book. You can find it in the digital chart supplemental in the documents section of ForeFlight if you use that too. And it will correlate the climb gradient with the vertical speed. And it depends on the ground speed, right? The faster that you're going, the greater your vertical speed needs to be to maintain a certain climb gradient. There's also a simple rule of thumb is to figure what your ground speed is in miles per minute and then just multiply that. So if you're climbing at 120 knots ground speed, that's 2 nautical miles per minute. And so you just multiply the required climb gradient by 2. So that 200 foot per mile gradient becomes a 400 foot per minute climb. And that's a simple way to get you in the ballpark. And you probably want to err on the conservative side there, err on the faster speed side because it is ground speed. If you pick up a tailwind, then that hurts your climb gradient.
Perfect. Thanks. We'll get on to vectors to final.
All right. And this one's going to lead off with another poll question. This one I would say doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It might depending on who you ask. But do you use the vectors to final function on your GPS? In other words, ATC is giving you vectors to final. Do you choose activate vectors to final on your GPS, or do you do something different like load from an IAF and activate a leg? All right, looks like the yeses have it at 60% to 40%. So let's get into why you would want to do one or the other. And we're going to use this ILS runway 32 at California Redwood Coast, Humboldt County, and Arcata, Eureka, California. We'll just call it Arcata. So this is what happens when you use the vectors to final function in an older GPS. This is a Garmin GNS 530. And this is where you may have, those of you who don't use the vectors to final function might have come across that advice when you were flying a unit like this and you were told by an instructor to never activate vectors to final, but rather to load the whole procedure from an IAF and activate a leg. And this is why. So on the 530, we've got VOLU, which is the final approach fix. And then the GNS just draws a line outside of that on the extended final approach course for you to intercept. If you look at the profile view of the chart, though, what's missing are all the fixes beyond that. So SAGU, JEBGA, and VOMAC. And the step downs at those fixes still do matter. You do need to clear those at or above. Now, probably following the glide slope will clear those. If you look at the TERPS manual again, the ideal design is to have a glide slope that clears all the step downs, and they do that whenever it's possible, but it's not always possible. So it's not a guarantee that just blindly following the glide slope will clear those step downs. You do need to verify. And you could do that by just using the distance to each fix and doing the math and determining that you're crossing at or above. Some people don't like to do math while flying an airplane. The other problem that you could run into is if ATC gives you direct to one of these fixes. So suppose they vector you out on a downwind and then a base, and then rather than telling you, giving you a heading to intercept in your approach clearance, they say something like clear direct JEBGA, maintain at or above such and such until established cleared ILS. And in that case, you don't have VOMAC or JEBGA in the GPS anymore, and so going direct to that fix is going to be a problem potentially. You have to reload the approach or find some other creative solution. So that's why the common SOP for these units is to load an IAF and then activate a leg on the final approach course rather than using the final vectors to final function. I would say really the bottom line here is just know how it works, right? If you are going to be okay with having the final approach fix and an extension of the final approach course and that's it, then fine. I don't see any harm necessarily in activating vectors to final, but just know the pitfalls of doing that. Now on the newer GPS units, this is the GTN 750XI, it works a little bit differently. It still has a course to VOLU selected, just like it does on the GNS, but all those extra fixes that are along the final approach course are available in the flight plan. You're not going to fly over them, it's not going to sequence through them, but they are available and you can activate a leg between them or do a direct to one of them. And that saves you a lot of that trouble. Activate vectors to final also will auto slew. If you've got an auto slewing HSI to the inbound course, it'll auto switch the CDI to VLOC at the right time. And it's simple, right? So in my opinion, if you're flying something newer like the GTN series, using the vectors to final function is totally fine. There are instructors whose opinion I respect that disagree with that and that would still recommend activating a leg, loading an IF and activating a leg. So again, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. The bottom line is just understand what your GPS does when you do either of these options and make your choice according to what you need. This is what it looks like on the map here. You can see VOLU, the line outside of it, and all those fixes are on the map. It's not counting down to them because it's running you a course to VOLU, but it's very easy to see just visually when you're crossing those. And you know, you can also activate a leg or do a direct if you need it to be more precise. A related note here, activate approach on these units is never something that you have to do. You don't have to activate an approach on a Garmin GPS in any situation. All it does is send you direct to the IAF or the transition waypoint that you chose. So if you want to go direct to the IAF, then activate approach will do that. Also, just going into the flight plan and choosing direct will do that. And so activating a leg, totally fine. You don't need to activate an approach. Where is ATC vectoring to on the final approach course? This is useful for being able to anticipate when you're going to get the turns and also knowing where you can request a closer vector if you need to. So it depends on whether it's a ground-based approach like the ILS at the top here or an RNAV approach like the one at the bottom. But generally speaking, they have an approach gate that's a mile outside of the final approach fix, as long as that's at least 5 miles from the runway. And on a ground-based approach like the ILS, they can vector you to within, or they can vector you right up to the approach gate in VMC conditions, but they have to be 2 miles outside of it in IMC. You can request a vector all the way up to the final approach fix if you want. So in an emergency situation or anything that required some expedience, you could do that. The difference, and this is kind of an important gotcha here, is the RNAV version, ATC doesn't vector within 2 miles of the approach gate, so within 3 miles at least of the final approach fix. And the reason for that is that some GPSs won't handle, in some circumstances, won't handle the sequencing or the CDI scaling correctly if they intercept that close to the final approach fix. So you can expect a slightly wider intercept on an RNAV approach. Still, if you had an emergency and you needed to get in as quickly as you could request that in an emergency situation, request a tighter vector to the final approach fix, but just know that sequencing and scaling could become an issue. Vectors to a bendy final. So if you take a look at this approach, this is in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The final approach course is on a 326 degree course. The intermediate fix outside of that is on 311. The one before that is on 296, and then there are other completely different courses from the various IAFs before that. So if you were being vectored to final on this approach, you might rightly ask, where am I actually being vectored to? Is it an extension of the final approach course, the last intermediate course? Is it just whatever leg I happen to join? This would have made a good poll question, but I don't have a poll question for this. So think of your answer to yourself. But the actual answer here is on an approach with bends outside the final approach fix, you'll be vectored to an extension of the last intermediate leg, the leg to the final approach fix, or to the leg itself. So if you intercepted outside of Herrick, it would still be on that 311 degree course, which doesn't correspond to any course on the chart, but that's what it is. And Garmin, for one, does this right. If you activate vectors to final, this is the leg that you're going to get. Now this particular approach is kind of unusual because of how many bends there are, but it's not unusual for there to be at least one bend at or outside the final approach fix. And it's certainly not unusual to be vectored to an approach like that. Here's a tip, heading bug before readback. So when you're being vectored and you get a heading to fly, the first thing to do is to set the heading bug and then read back what you set on the heading bug as you begin the turn. Think of how many times you might have been given a heading, started the turn, and then said, wait, what was the heading again? Or did I bug that correctly? But if you always bug it and then read back what you bugged, that should be verification that you got it right. Now, the one exception to this is the last vector where you're being vectored to join the final approach course and you're getting the approach clearance that comes with it. The reason that's an exception is it's time sensitive. ATC wants you to start that turn right away. A second or two of delay is not ideal. So in that case, start the turn right away. In that case, you also have a means to predict in advance what the heading is going to be, which leads into the approach clearance format. So PTAC is what controllers use for approach clearances. And this is something that's intimidating to a lot of newer IFR pilots when you get something like November 123 Papa Whiskey's 5 miles from Volu, turn left heading 330, maintain 3000 until established on the localizer, cleared ILS 32 approach. It's just a lot of stuff, a lot of information. But the reality is that it comes in a consistent format, and there are only a couple things here that you really need to pay attention to. So that's how it breaks down into the PTAC format: position, turn, altitude, and clearance. And really the turn and the altitude are the only two things that you need to have recall on, that you need to take action on. So sure, you want the position report from ATC to be correct. And if it's not, that should raise a red flag. But if it is, you don't need to remember that anymore. Same with the clearance, right? If they cleared you for something other than the ILS 3.2, okay, you've got a problem, but you don't need to remember that or do anything with that information. So all you're really looking for in this final vectored approach clearance is the heading and the altitude. You'll read back that along with cleared ILS 3.2. The turn, the heading, is predictable because it's always going to be within 30 degrees of the final approach course. So you can anticipate that this would have to be 330 or 340 most likely. And the altitude is probably going to be the one you're at, but it's going to make sense for the altitudes that are on the chart. So once you know that format and know what you're listening for, this becomes predictable, like a lot of things with ATC do, and it's not so much information actually. Okay, John, any questions on that section?
Yeah, there's some good ones here. I'll try to summarize maybe one that I think opens up a lot here. So hopefully this isn't a rabbit hole, but is it possible to enter approach mode too early? So I think in this case, maybe both from a GPS navigator and also maybe an autopilot standpoint, is there such a thing as too early, or maybe put it better, when should I go to approach mode?
Sure, yeah, the pretty common SOP if you're talking approach mode on an autopilot is that when you're cleared for the approach, you engage or you arm approach mode, so the glide slope becomes arm. Now that can vary depending on the autopilot like that you have. So I fly a plane with an older Century autopilot where the approach mode is both lateral and vertical. And if I armed approach mode, if I actually entered approach mode, while on the T leg of a GPS approach or something, it would take it out of GPS roll steering. But in general, arming the approach mode when you get the approach clearance is a good idea. You don't want to do it when if you wouldn't want to capture the glide path and start coming down, you wouldn't want to do it because if you haven't been cleared to do that yet and the glide slope centers and it starts following it down, that's obviously not what you want. But the approach clearance implies that you're going to be following that, so that's a good time to do it.
Here's another one
And
that I've experienced. I see some controllers who are kind of uncomfortable with vectors to final on a RNAV approach, which sounds weird, but it seems like they have no problem doing it for an ILS, especially if it's an airline airport. But if I'm going to a smaller GA airport, they seem to love to give me the T fixes on initial approach fix. Can I request vectors to final?
sure, yeah, you can always make a request like that, and that's where sometimes pilots go wrong with the activate vectors to final mode because they'll be getting what sound like vectors to final. And so they'll activate vectors to final, but really what the controller is doing is getting them outside of a 90-degree angle from the IAF, or the IAF / intermediate fix, depending on how the approach is laid out, so that they don't have to fly the course reversal. But then you get clear direct, such and such, clear for the approach, and that fix isn't there anymore, right? But yeah, you can certainly
Yep.
request vectors to final.
Okay, great. We'll let you take it away for the next one.
Okay. Follow advisory plus V guidance is the last section here. And we're going to begin with a poll question again. Just when was the last time you flew a real instrument approach with no vertical guidance available, either official or advisory? Last month, last year, last 5 years, or never for real, only for practice? So this is, most modern WAS GPSs are going to give you plus V or some equivalent of advisory vertical guidance on almost every approach. My question is, when have you done for real an approach, not for practice, that had no vertical guidance? Okay, so overwhelmingly never for real, only for practice. 55% there, 18% in the last 5 years, 16% in the last year, and only 11 within the last month. And I think that just underlines how many of these approaches have some form of vertical guidance available now. It's just really hard to find an approach that you would fly without any vertical guidance unless you have a non-WAS GPS, or you might be somewhere where a localizer approach happens to be the best option. That happens somewhere. Localizer approaches never come with +V guidance. But there are a lot of approaches that don't have official vertical guidance. And so we're often flying with this advisory vertical guidance that's meant to assist you as you fly these approaches. But it's not always quite as simple as it feels. There are some gotchas to this method that I want to explore here. So we're going to start this with the RNAV runway 7 at Sydney Municipal in Sydney, New York. And the basic principle of advisory vertical guidance is it turns what would otherwise be the green path here into the magenta path. The way you would normally fly this approach, say with a non-WAS GPS, or with if you elected to ignore the advisory guidance, would be you would descend from 2700 straight down to the MDA, level there, fly there until you reach the missed approach point and go missed, or get in a position to land and land. Or you might try to fly a continuous descent, but without any guidance. But either way, the magenta then is what the +V guidance does, and it just kind of creates an ideal descent path for you to the runway, and makes it feel a lot more like a normal vertically guided approach, whether it be an LPV or an ILS. There are some caveats to this, which boil down to the fact that +V is not official guidance. It's not actually part of a procedure. It's your GPS helping you fly the procedure more smoothly. And Garmin provides this for nearly all straight-in approaches now, and even some circling approaches that happen to be aligned with the runway get +V advisory guidance now. But there's nothing on the chart, at least the standard government charts, that tell you that you're going to get this. And it's useful to know in advance because you will actually strategize these approaches potentially differently than you would without the +V guidance. So how do we know we're going to get +V guidance? Well, again, it depends what GPS you have here. So the top version here is a GTN 750. And you can see when you go to load the RNAV runway 7 that it has LNAV minimums and it'll come with +V guidance. The RNAV 25 in the other direction is LP minimums, which again does not come with official vertical guidance, but you will get the +V. So you can know that in advance just by going to load a procedure in the GTN series. And you can actually do that, before your flight. You can load it up in the actual GPS, or you can load it up in the Garmin trainer, with the one caveat to that being that the GPS database in the trainer might not be exactly current. So it's possible you could get different information there. The GNS series down below is a 530. Same screen, or the equivalent screen to the one on the GTN above, doesn't show you the same information here. So you can load the RNAV 7 or the RNAV 25. Doesn't tell you what sort of minimums you're going to get, what sort of advisory guidance you're going to get. And the same trick with loading it up in the trainer and trying to fly it doesn't necessarily work here, because the database that comes with the GNS trainer is so old. So in this case, you kind of find out when you fly the approach what you're going to get. And other GPSs, the Avidyne stuff, has its own ways of showing you this, but focus on Garmin here mostly. So some of the traps to these +V guided procedures. Again, these boil down to it not being official guidance at all. And the first one is that you get no protection from it below the MDA. And this approach, it's particularly dramatic. This screen is what the view out the front window looks like. About 300 feet below MDA, you can see we're locked right onto that +V glide path, right on course, and we're going to hit the hill. The runway here, you can't quite make out the runway because of the low resolution of the picture, but it's in the valley beyond the hill. You can just barely see it. So the runway's in sight, but there's a hill in the way. And, we're supposed to be visual here, of course, but you can imagine how if the visibility was poor or if the lighting conditions were poor, this hill could really come into play. And it's not as dramatic on a lot of other procedures, but in a way that is more, it's sneakier if there's a tower or something or some trees that just get too close to the approach path. But this +V guidance is going to take you too close to them. This is from the Garmin trainer, just a couple 100 feet lower. And you can see on the PFD on the left, just to the left of the airspeed tape, it says AGL 0. And again, we're right on that glide path coupled to it. The GTN map screen on the right shows us over red terrain, so it's not more than 100 feet below us. And this is a fun one to try in the sim because it really drives home that you have no business following these blindly below MDA because you do hit the hill on this approach. Trap number 2 here. So on that approach, the MDA is pretty high. It's 1,100 feet. And so you're going to be pushing 4 miles from the runway by the time you reach MDA while following the +V guidance. Visibility could be as low as 1.25 miles, depending on the category you're flying here. So there's a good chance that you won't see the runway from the point where the +V guidance intersects with the MDA. If this were an LPV approach, you would have to go missed there. If it were a decision altitude, you couldn't continue, you'd have to go missed. But what this LNAV minimum allows you to do, of course, is level off at the MDA and continue all the way to the missed approach point at the runway 7 threshold, and gives you the opportunity to get closer to the runway and see it and potentially still land on this approach. But this point where you intersect with the MDA, you know you're on the correct normal glide path here. And so any amount that you continue past that, that glide path becomes steeper. And so maybe from here it's okay, maybe it's not, depends on the conditions, depends on what you're flying. But certainly there's a point from this 1,100-foot MDA where it's too late to land straight in. And the key is that if you're going to fly this approach this way, you need to determine in advance where your practical missed approach point is going to be. Sure, you may be able to get away with flying past the essentially what is the VDP here, but how far? Because this is a tough decision to make in the moment, and by the time it's too steep, it might be too late once you descend below the MDA. Now this MDA being so high, this could be an opportunity to make this a circling approach and just stay at the MDA. It's 1,100 feet, so it's even above pattern altitude. And if the visibility is good, just follow it until you get over the airport and enter a pattern and land. And it's a circling approach, but really it's just a traffic pattern. But the key point is that these are decisions that are a little bit more gray than they would be if you were flying an LPV or an ILS. And you have to consider these and strategize and set some objective decision points in advance before you find yourself close to the airport trying to decide whether you should, whether it's too steep, whether you should go around, whether you should enter the pattern and circle. These need to be made in advance. Trap number 3 on these +V glide paths is step downs. So here's an approach at Elkins, West Virginia, where the final approach fix is at Aleem, and then there are 2 step down fixes inside of that. If this were an LPV approach, you wouldn't have to worry about step downs inside the final approach fix, but because the +V is just an assistance, it's not an actual part of the approach, those step downs are still very much in play. Now, if you look at, this is the image on the left here is from Garmin Pilot. It's the new smart charts for this approach, and it's the profile view. This gives you an idea of how Garmin designs the +V guidance. And what they do, you can see, first of all, if you were to start at 4,500 at the final approach fix and just draw a straight line from there down to the runway threshold, you would clip underneath these minimum altitudes. And there's a misconception, I think, that that's what Garmin and other providers do with their +V guidance. They just draw a straight line from the final approach fix to the runway touchdown zone without regard to the step down altitudes. And so I've seen pilots just ignore the +V altogether because they feel like it's going to bust these altitudes. But the reality is that Garmin actually takes the steepest angle of any of the descent angles on these segments. Or another way of saying that would be it takes the shallowest angle it can that'll clear all of the step downs. So here it's going to set its plus V guidance along this 3.62 degree visual descent angle such that it clears all the step downs along the way. And that means it's at higher than 4,500 at the final approach fix. Or in other words, if you're at 4,500, you're going to intercept this glide path beyond the final approach fix. So that's something to be ready for. You're thinking of on an approach like this starting down at the final approach fix, but if you're following the plus V, that's actually going to happen after that. But the obvious plus side to this is that you should clear all the step downs if you follow Garmin's plus V guidance. Now, again, it's the unofficial guidance versus the official charted step downs, and you need to verify that you're crossing at or above them. But even on an approach like this with multiple step downs, coupling to the plus V should do the job and makes this approach much simpler than if you were doing this the old school dive and drive way with multiple legs and multiple altitudes. And then I would say trap number 4 here is complacency. So there's a lot of these procedures that feel so much like a normal LPV coupled approach that you can sit back and relax and break out of minimums at a low altitude, right, and just land. But a lot of these approaches go to airports that you wouldn't have had an approach to in the past because they wouldn't have had the ground infrastructure for it. Don't have approach lights. This airport here has a 2,600-foot runway, and an approach that's going to feel a lot like an ILS or an LPV, but in reality is actually something that's more tricky, can kind of catch you sleeping. And there's other approaches that might have bends in the approach, but there's still things that you can couple to and follow all the way down. It's worth briefing these in detail and with an eye toward the actual strategy that you're going to use, rather than just kind of blindly follow them down. And the simplicity that the equipment offers can be so valuable. It lets us get into airports that we wouldn't be able to get into otherwise, much easily than otherwise, but it also can be a trap if you're not careful. And that is the end.
Great tips, Ryan. Great tips. A lot of good things there. One question that came up from an attendee here, I think, is a good one, which is, okay, I understand the traps of the plus V. How do I know if I'm on plus V? Specifically, if I'm looking at my PFD there, I'm looking at the magenta glide path diamond. I know that green means ILS and magenta means GPS, but are there any other indications that I'm on an advisory glide slope and not a real LPV glide slope?
Yeah, your GPS is always going to enunciate what sort of guidance you're getting. So see if I have a screen here. Looks like I cropped them just right so that you can't see that. Well, here you go on the PFD here. Down on the HSI, it says LNAV+V. That same enunciation is going to be, if you're working with the GTN, it's the bottom strip there. It'll say LNAV+V. The plus V is always unofficial versus if it were LNAV/VNAV, that's a different thing, or LPV.
Great. And a specific question, if you want to go to that slide, Ryan, on trap number 3, why didn't the plus V slope go all the way to the missed approach point?
Yeah, I don't know why. Well, so if it took you to the missed approach point at the MDA, you'd be way too high to land, right? So where it's actually taking you is to the touchdown zone of the runway, and that's going to intersect the MDA well before the missed approach point. The reason I assume it's not depicted below the MDA is to drive home the point that it's not offering any kind of protection below the MDA, but it doesn't actually go away. It still stays on your equipment as you fly it.
Yeah, and a great reminder there that when you get to MDA, you're leveling out. It's MDA. The glide slope stops there, and you showed a couple great examples of why that is. But I think that may be the ultimate takeaway when it's an advisory glide slope is You're still going to MDA. You're not flying all the way to the runway.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you like a good strategy on approaches like this, it's a conservative strategy, but it's a good one, is to treat it as much like a precision approach as you can, and not level off at the MDA and continue, but go miss there instead if you don't see the runway. It just ensures that it's going to be a stabilized approach no matter what. But if you do that, to John's point, you can't dip below the MDA at all like you might on an ILS DA or an LPV DA. So you have to anticipate how much altitude you're going to lose while you power up and go around, so you don't go below that hard floor at all.
All this is a great reminder to be familiar with your unique avionics. I think you did a good job on a couple of these of showing the difference between a GNS navigator and a GTN navigator can be different, and certainly Avidyne, Aspen, other avionics have their own quirks as well. So I would just make a plug for the simulator apps that are out there from a lot of the avionics manufacturers. It's a great thing to do to sit on the couch and try this at 0 knots and 1G and make sure you understand some of those different options, because my rule personally is never descend from the final approach fix unless you're absolutely sure where you are, where you're going, and what your minimums are, because certainly 100 feet above what you think are minimums is not the time to be asking these questions.
Agreed.
Well, Ryan, thanks for a very informative presentation. Really appreciate all the very practical, hands-on information there. Lots to learn. Again, a reminder that you can learn lots more about IFR procedures in that IFR Procedures pilot-friendly manual from PilotWorkshops, a great resource. I would highly recommend picking that up. Available at pilotworkshops.com. And please join us again for another Sporties webinar in the future. You can find our upcoming webinars at sporties.com/webinars. Thanks for attending. Hope to see you again soon on another webinar, and please fly safely.